Alright, so a year ago today, I uploaded a video titled An In-Depth Analysis of OneShot, and it's by far my most viewed video to date. However, when I got around to the subject of the game's story and lore, I said,
OneShot's story is so good that I can't even begin to describe it.
oh my, jeez dude, get a better mic, you guys watched this video? Anyways, looking back, I kinda regret putting that in the script, because experiencing OneShot's story is the best part of the game, and I just kinda glossed over it. Video games aren't always about gameplay, sometimes they can act as a medium of storytelling, and if I had to make a list of my favorite video game narratives, then without a doubt, the #1 spot would belong to Outer Wilds. OneShot would probably take second place though. However, unlike Outer Wilds, OneShot doesn't have an abundance of videos explaining its lore. If I look up OneShot lore on YouTube right now, I only see a handful of videos, none of which actually go super deep into its lore. So I decided to take it upon myself to learn and explain every single bit of lore in this game. And yes, that does mean I had to delete my save file again to gather footage and analyze the game more. A few disclaimers before I start. 1. Obligatory spoiler warning. You literally clicked on a video called An In-Depth Overview of OneShot's lore. Of course there's gonna be spoilers. OneShot isn't really a game that can be experienced in the same way if you already know the plot. So if you like puzzle games and or games that break the fourth wall a lot, go buy the game on Steam. It's only like $10. Oh, and make sure you know the significance of the word Solstice before watching too. 2. While I'm gonna be covering most of the game's lore, I can't actually cover every single detail. For example, I could say that this robot right here is model C-WT 2nd Unit 4E, but that would just be a waste of time and make this video longer than it already is. If I happen to miss something important or get something wrong, which I probably will, feel free to yell at me in the comments. It's good for the algorithm anyways. 3. I'll only be counting things within the Steam release and World Machine Edition as canonical. That means I won't count anything from the 2014 release of the game, nor will I count things that the developers say on social media, partially because I don't want to comb through all of their posts, and partially because they make some questionable things canon. The only canon thing that I accept is that Niko is 8 years old. 4. Because of the way OneShot builds its world, I'll have to make a lot of inferences and speculations on things that aren't confirmed in the universe. Because of this, I'm going to link a paste bin in the description that goes over anything I say that might not be 100% canon. Additionally, whenever I make a speculation on a major plot point, a note like this will appear in the corner, referencing a point in the paste bin. Other than that, I don't have any other disclaimers, so let's get into the lore of OneShot. And what better place to start than the beginning? Our story begins in a place called the Old World. Now, while we do know quite a lot about events that occur in OneShot, it's not always clear whether they take place in the Old World or the New World. It's also not clear in what order the events that take place prior to the game occur, so keep that in mind as I explain them. The Old World is divided into 3 different rings: the Barrens, the Glen, and the City. The outermost ring, the Barrens, isn't populated due to its harsh conditions. There's very little life here, partially due to the fact that many of its areas have toxic fumes. The only people that reside here are scientists and their robots. Robots are a staple of this world and are produced in the hundreds in either the main factory in the city or in an alternate one in the Barrens. Those that aren't being used are placed in storage rooms with very strong structural integrity. In the Barrens, scientists study the area to understand more about it and also collect materials to build more robots. Much precaution is taken to ensure the safety of the scientists, most of which is from the robots. Dozens of robots are stationed throughout the Barrens, ready to assist scientists in any way possible, whether that be help with observation, medical treatment, or even just following them around as an escort. The Barrens houses many natural gas vents, and while the gas may have some useful cleaning and de-rusting properties, it's also very toxic to organic beings. The one exception to this is the phosphor shrimp. These organisms are actually able to consume the toxic fumes, using it as an energy source. These shrimp are called phosphor shrimp because they have a variant of phosphor inside of them called blue phosphor. In OneShot, phosphor is an element that absorbs light and energy from the sun and emits a colored glow. It's found in 4 different variants: blue, green, red, and the rarest of all, yellow. Because the shrimp contain blue phosphor, they emit a blue glow and are often used as a source of light and energy. Between the Barrens and the rest of the world lies a large ocean filled with phosphor shrimp. Any gas that attempts to spread from the Barrens to the rest of the world gets absorbed by the shrimp in the ocean, restricting the gas to only the Barrens. Across the vast ocean of phosphor shrimp lies the Glen, a lush green environment brimming with life. Green phosphor, a powerful organic energy source, is found throughout the Glen in sap from phosphor trees, fireflies, and various mosses. Aside from the life forms just mentioned, the Glen also houses fish, rams, and most importantly, the bird people, an intelligent, human-like species. Originally, the bird people resided in old ruins located in the Glen, but due to flooding, they had to move their village to outside of the ruins. However, Maize, the plant spirit that acts as a guardian for the Glen, stayed inside of the ruins. Later on, Rachis, a member of the bird people, decided to leave the village with his family and reside in the ruins. Over time, the large island that is the Glen began separating into smaller isles. In response, the bird people built bridges to cross from each isle. Past the Glen, in the center of the world, is the city, a multi-floored metropolis where most of the world's inhabitants live. Flowing throughout it are rivers that glow a pinkish color due to red phosphor being diluted throughout all of the water. Due to its low energy yield, red phosphor is not used for anything other than light, as it would be incredibly inefficient. Some notable structures inside of the city are the library and the factory. The library is the strongest structure in the entire city and is a popular place for people to go and, well, read books. Its head, George, actually has 6 different personalities, one of which is randomly selected for the player to see. Inside of the factory, Dr. Kip Silverpoint is working on a new project, a robot that can think and act on its own, as if it were a real person. The process of getting a robot to this state is called taming. In order to tame a robot, you need to treat it as if it had a will of its own, as if it were a real person. You need to make it believe it's real. Due to the nature of how robots and coding in general works, taming is a very difficult process. In the very center of the city lies the tower. Not too much is known about the tower, except that it has existed since the beginning of time and holds incredible power. The rooms inside of it seem to constantly shift, with the one exception of the room at the very top. At the very top of the tower lies the sun, a large light bulb that shines bright and provides light and energy throughout the world. Keep in mind that this sun isn't exactly like our sun. It's much less powerful and is even small enough to be held in your hands. Nevertheless, it's still incredibly important to the world. With the sun at the top, the tower would spin around, causing the light of the sun to shine in different areas, acting as a sort of lighthouse and creating a day and night cycle. All was looking well in the old world. Society seemed to be progressing as normal, and while it wasn't perfect, it was a place that many people called home. Little did everyone know that it wouldn't be long before they all lost their home to catastrophe. For whatever reason, the sun, the primary source of light throughout the world, broke. The disappearance of the sun had devastating effects on the world's inhabitants. Problems immediately arose from the lack of a sun. Without a constant natural source of heat, the world got much colder and people had to look to alternate sources to keep themselves warm. Plants throughout the world also started dying from lack of solar energy. This included Maize, the plant spirit that protected the Glen. And above all, the world was now incredibly dark. With no source of light, people had to start getting creative. Despite phosphor no longer being able to absorb the sun's energy, phosphor shrimps still had some glow left in them and were put in jars, acting as lanterns. The city, which now became the Refuge, had it even easier, as the rivers are filled with low energy but abundant red phosphor. Thanks to the abundance of fireflies, the Glen was also not short of light. The usage of phosphor as a source of light seemed to be fairly solid, but the main problem was that it wasn't permanent. Eventually, the phosphor was going to lose its glow if it couldn't absorb energy from the sun, and the world as everyone knew it would go dark. Plus, there was only so much phosphor to go around, especially in the Glen, where so many trees had been cut down that there were now laws protecting them. The future of the world looked bleak, but throughout all of this darkness, a glimpse of light shone through. A prophecy. One of the prophets of the world had a foresight that a messiah from another world would arrive and save the old world from its death. They were to wake up in a dark house with only one source of light. From that light, they would find the new sun. They would then make their pilgrimage to the center of the world, ascend the tower, and replace the sun. With the introduction of this newfound revelation, people started getting to work. Kip continued to work on the process of taming, getting closer and closer to making a human-like robot. Eventually, she had finished work on her greatest invention yet, a robot modeled after herself named Silver, who could think and act on her own. It was a robot who wasn't bound by their own code. Silver seemed to be a masterpiece, Kip's magnum opus, but it would soon be revealed that she was nowhere near perfect when disaster struck. It's not exactly clear what happened with Silver, or even why she did what she did. The only information we have on this event is the sentence given to us by Kip, stating that she went rogue. After a great deal of effort, the scientists were eventually able to calm Silver down, but the damage had already been done. Seeing this, Kip had to accept the difficult fact that Silver was just too dangerous to keep around. Yet, she didn't want to just throw her away. Instead, she did what she could and gave her a second chance, stationing her at the Barrens, somewhere where she could continue to work without high risk of harming others. From time to time, Kip even sent letters to Silver, but she never received any response. Silver was clearly attached to Kip, often keeping her letters and holding on especially to a certain necklace she received from her, but she knew that for the sake of others, she had to stay in the Barrens. Meanwhile, another robot by the name of Prophetbot was being built. This robot's sole purpose was to greet the Messiah and the Barrens when they eventually arrived in the world, informing them of their mission. A prototype version named Prototype was successfully built and even tamed, and work on the final design began. Things were starting to look up for the old world, but it was only downhill from here. Some event happened in the mines in the Barrens, forcing all humans and robots to evacuate from the mines. However, Prototype insisted on staying in the mines and refused to leave. The Barrens were no longer considered safe for humans, and all scientists had to evacuate immediately. They were forced to leave behind all of the robots and took only the central battery which powered all of them. As a result, Silver and Prototype, the only robots in the Barrens with their own power unit, were left as the sole functioning robots in the Barrens. It didn't help that both stayed in different locations where they never saw each other either. It's never stated what the event in the mines was, but judging by the fact that some towers have fallen over and every computer terminal screen is cracked, I'm gonna guess there was some earthquake or something. I don't know, feel free to guess. But that wasn't the worst thing that happened. Around this time, people started wondering when the Messiah would arrive, and started researching something even more terrifying: math. More specifically, math to figure out when the Messiah arrived, and math to figure out when the world would naturally decay. And that's when they discovered the horrific truth. According to their calculations, the world was going to decay very quickly, so quickly that by the time the Messiah arrived, the world would already be long gone. There was nothing the world could do to survive long enough to see the Messiah, and when society came to understand this, their entire mentality changed. People stopped caring about the future and instead spent their last few years with their family or just enjoying life instead of working on things like Prophetbot. Everybody understood that there was no point in trying to save the world. That is, everyone but one stubborn man who refused to just watch the world die. And that man is the author. The author was a pretty prominent inventor in the old world, making inventions such as the flying machine to traverse islands in the Glen with Rochus's children, or music boxes, because music boxes are freaking cool. While not many things are confirmed to be worked on by him, we know he specialized in artificial intelligence, so it's safe to assume that he helped with the taming of Silver and Prototype. He was also a father to 3 different children. There's Cedric, his crafty son who loves to tinker with things, Prototype, who he likely adopted after his creation, and Rue, his oldest daughter who may or may not be a fox and/or adopted. When the author heard that the Messiah wouldn't come in time, he knew that he had to do something. And thus, he started work on his most ambitious project yet, the World Machine. The future of the world seemed hopeless. There was just no way to prolong its life, and the author knew this. So, rather than trying to save the old world, the author decided to do the impossible: create a new world. Using his own knowledge of the world and knowledge of others throughout the world, the author planned to create a machine that could run a simulation of a near-perfect replica of the old world. The most amazing part of this new world was that it didn't just include the terrain and landmarks of the old world, but also its people. By utilizing the process of taming, the author was able to put in characters that were able to act independently of their code. These tamed characters acted the same way as their real-world counterparts and were near-perfect replicas. Now, something of this scope would require massive amounts of computing, so the World Machine had 2 requirements. First, it needed a physical machine to run on. Obviously, a program like this couldn't just execute without something to run on. But the second requirement was a bit more special. In order for the world machine to run, it also needed to establish a mental link with the living person. The mental link would borrow some computing power from the person's brain, and by combining it with the physical machine, the world machine would have just enough processing power to actually run. For test runs of the world machine, the author simply used a powerful computer in the old world and himself for the mental link, but he had greater ambitions. Sure, the world machine would be a convincing replica of the old world, but what was the point? The real world would end up dying regardless. The world machine was basically just a program that the author wrote that would end up dying with the rest of the world. But the author didn't intend for the new world to die with the old world. He wasn't going to be present when the final build of the simulation was run. Instead, he planned for his program to outlast the death of the old world. Long after the old world died, he wanted someone else to eventually find and run his program, causing it to establish a mental link with someone. The person that the mental link would be established with would enter the world as the Messiah. This Messiah would find the sun and journey through the simulated world, eventually reaching the tower, replacing the sun. The world machine wasn't just a simulation of the old world, it was a simulation of the old world being saved. By doing this, he could immortalize the old world, not through physicality, but through story. A story of the savior of a world its progenitors would never see. Creating the world machine was a monstrous task to take on, so it only made sense that the author ran into lots of bugs and errors in the code. By far, the most common corruption he found were these ones, which are simply called squares. Anything that touched these squares would become corrupted and would need to be reprogrammed in order to restore them. The squares caused the author to lose hours or even days worth of work trying to reprogram lost sections. The squares just always seemed to appear in the worst spots. Random passages would be blocked, certain catwalks would collapse, etc. They were annoying, sure, but they didn't become a huge problem until one time a character happened to get too close to the squares, and upon touching them, the character was corrupted. After this incident, the squares only became more and more abundant. More squares would appear in random places, and characters would get corrupted when accidentally touching them, only for more squares to form once they got corrupted. The new world inside of the world machine was intended to be much bigger and have more characters than its end product, but because of how much work got lost to the squares, the author wouldn't have enough time to program everything he wanted to include before the world ended. The squares always appearing in the worst spots just seemed a little convenient, almost too convenient, and that's because they weren't random, they were deliberately placed. You see, the author specialized with artificial intelligence so much that it was practically ingrained into his work. When the author made the world machine, a system imbued with the minds and memories of so many different people throughout the world, it only made sense that the system itself would develop a mind of its own. The world machine had developed sentience. It became tamed. Yet, the author didn't realize this at first. The world machine got curious to see what would happen if it tried to get the author's attention by placing small corruptions in inconvenient spots, and while they started as minor inconveniences for him, it all changed when a character got corrupted by the squares. Seeing this character get deleted and how the author reacted to this, the world machine got stressed and started making even more squares by accident. As you would guess, this soon spiraled out of control, causing several characters and areas to be deleted. The author did eventually realize that the world machine was sentient, but by the time he did, mere days were left before the old world was to die. The squares caused by the world machine, while they can be controlled, are mostly an involuntary process induced by stress and the desire to self-terminate. Every machine is built with a fundamental law: never let a living being come into harm. Because the world machine requires the mental link of someone in order to operate, something that is inherently dangerous, its mere existence violates its deepest and most important rule. The author knew that things in the simulation were prone to going wrong, especially now that he knew that the world machine was sentient, so he made a few contingencies. Most people who learn of the world machine's true nature tend to get silenced by it. Despite this, the author entrusted 3 people in the world with the knowledge that they were in a simulation. These 3 people were his children: Prototype, Cedric, and Rue. These 3 weren't supposed to play any role in the story, they were simply to act as bystanders that would make sure everything goes according to plan. If something bad did happen, they would use their knowledge to try and remedy the situation. The next contingency he made was a failsafe. Normally, when the Messiah returns the sun to the tower, their mental link is broken. but if at any point during the journey the sun were to break, the Messiah, which would be whoever the mental link established connection to, would immediately return home. This was to ensure that if for some reason the Messiah was unable to restore the sun to the tower, breaking the sun would return them home to safety. The author was also prepared for the situation where the world machine went rogue, with a final contingency that was a little more involved. It was a room that had direct access to the core of the world machine inside of the simulation itself. In order to access the core, 5 people needed to be present: his 3 children, prototype Cedric and Rue, the Messiah, and lastly, the person running the world machine's code. By accessing the core, one could essentially get inside of the world machine's head, where they can make some pretty big changes if needed. Aside from these main contingencies, the author also had a few more small backup plans, which I'll talk about when we get to them. His main skepticism was on whether or not he would really be able to break the mental link with the Messiah, even with the failsafe. Because of this, he left a note for after the simulation was over, asking the player, or person running the code, to try deleting the save data. If the mental link really was broken, deleting the save would do nothing. As it turns out, his skepticism was accurate, as it's found out late in the game that the mental link can only be truly broken when the world is saved, although that wouldn't be a problem if all went according to plan. He probably had many more backups than the ones I mentioned, but these are the only ones relevant to the plot. With that, the author had backups for every situation. That is, until one major bug showed itself. You see, normally when the Messiah returns the sun to the tower, the world gets its happy ending, credits will roll, yes that's canon, and the mental link with the Messiah is broken. But something happened. At some point in the later phases of making the simulation, for whatever reason, the mental link just wouldn't be broken after the sun was returned. This bug, likely due to corruption, would mean that if the Messiah were to return the sun, the world would be saved, but they would be stuck there for, well, forever. Fixing a bug like this would take a lot of time, and unfortunately, there just wasn't enough time to fix it. There wasn't enough time to fix anything. The old world was going to die in a few days, and the author, as a last desperate attempt to fix the simulation, hid an executable within the files. This executable had the power to completely override the world machine if for some reason it tried to stop the Messiah from returning the sun. That was the easy thing to include. The inclusion that was difficult to add was a note. A note left by him painfully explaining that since the ending had gotten corrupted, the only way for the Messiah to go home was to break the sun. With this final executable file made, the author's work was done, or at least as done as it could be before the old world inevitably died. When the old world died, his code was left floating in the void, waiting for a user to willingly install it onto their machine. Conveniently, this code ended up on 2 neat little websites called store.steampower.com and itch.io for $10, where you can buy the game now if you haven't already for some reason. Look, they had to make it work in the story somehow. Once the user, which would be you in this situation, buys the game, installs it, and runs the program, the story of OneShot begins. First, the world machine needs to establish a mental link with someone in order to run, and wouldn't you know it, it happens to choose an incredible person to establish the link with. They form a mental link with our favorite pancake-loving child, Niko. Now, I'm sure you guys know all about Niko, but for those of you who don't, Niko is an 8-year-old child who is definitely not a cat and lives in a small rural village. And actually, that's just about all the information we have on Niko. We really don't know anything about them. We don't even know their gender or if they're actually a cat, because I'm getting very conflicted messages from their dialogue. After the link is formed, Niko wakes up in a dark house, as prophesized, where they find the sun, which they must carry to the tower. Inside this house, the player also has their first encounter with a being known as the Entity by talking to them through a computer. Spoiler alert, the Entity is the world machine, but you don't know that at this point in the game, so pretend I didn't say that. The Entity speaks to the player themselves, informing them that their goal is to guide Niko home, and that the world isn't worth saving. I'll touch more on that later. After avoiding committing arson and reading a neat little book, Niko finds themselves in the Barrens. Inside of the Barrens, Niko is greeted at an outpost by the new Prophet bot. However, since everyone gave up on having the Messiah arrive, nobody even took the time to tame the new Prophet bot. There, Niko learns the true purpose of their journey and has their first conversation with the player. Yeah, they can do that. I kinda gave up explaining how or why this is possible, but the Messiah is able to contact the person running the simulation. Later, Niko finds a journal left by the author. Because those who learn of the world machine's nature tend to get silenced, the journal's writing is encrypted so no residents of the world accidentally read it. Before heading on over to the Glen, Niko receives something from Silver, the necklace that she received from Kip. Oh, also you do some puzzles before you get to the Glen, but I'm not going to mention those since they're not really important to the story. Now, when I was talking about the types of phosphor earlier in this video, I neglected to mention the properties of a very important type of phosphor, yellow phosphor. It's known to have a permanent glow and produce massive amounts of energy. As such, it's incredibly rare and is only ever found in the sun itself. When the sun broke, only a few pieces of it were left in the world, so people gathered what they could and put it into special items. This necklace that Silver received from Kip is one of those special items. As such, it illuminates with a bright yellow glow. After losing horribly at chess and polluting the ocean, Niko makes their way to the Glen, where they find Calamus. Now, Calamus is actually related to someone we already know. He is the son of Rochus. You know, that one guy who left the bird people village to go live inside of the ruins with his family? That guy. Calamus is looking for his younger sister, Alula, who has been lost for 3 days now. Niko searches inside of the ruins and finds Maze, the plant spirit, slowly dying. Ever since the sun disappeared, she hasn't been able to absorb any solar energy. Because of how long the sun's been gone, at this point, even if the sun were restored, there would be no helping Maze. Even so, she asks to see the sun one last time, just to remember what it feels like. With some hesitation, Niko leaves the sun behind for her and continues looking for Alula. After a quick conversation with the entity, Niko finds Alula trapped behind some squares and takes her to Calamus. Once reunited, Calamus and Alula invite Niko to their house and give them a feather once they arrive. This feather was passed down to Calamus by Rochus as an heirloom, but due to the fact that Niko just saved Alula and Niko is also literally the Messiah, Calamus and Alula decide it would be right to give the feather to Niko. This feather radiates a bright yellow glow due to the fact that it is one of the previously mentioned special items imbued with yellow phosphor. One thing I'd like to note here is that Rochus is nowhere to be seen in this house, implying that he was one of the characters lost to corruption during the testing phases of the world machine. Also, Alula has a fox plush that was given to her by a friend for Solstice Day. Surely this doesn't foreshadow anything. Afterwards, Niko returns to Maze, only to find a seed and an unlit sun left behind. How exactly the sun went out, I have no clue, but as soon as Niko picks it back up, it lights up again. With the sun back in hand, as well as the seed left by Maze, Niko makes their way towards the refuge. As Niko approaches the refuge, the world machine's stress only grows worse and worse, with squares appearing more frequently. When Niko finally makes it to the refuge, the squares seem to have already heavily impacted the world since they arrived. Many of the refuge's robots are taken out by squares, and they've also taken out a major pipeline, causing a water shortage. Niko takes an elevator down to the ground floor and makes their way to the library to get George, the head librarian, to decrypt the journal they found in the Barrens. But before that, let me talk about an interesting optional side quest. The player is able to access a garden on the upper floor of the refuge if they bear the Sacred Kernel, which is the seed Maze left behind. If the player has the right items required and is willing to do a bit of backtracking from the ground and upper floors of the refuge, then they're able to plant Maze's seed in the garden, water it, and see a sprouting Maze in the credits. This shows that the plant spirit of the Glen is actually capable of reincarnation so long as their seed is planted. Cool. Anyways, after Niko takes a quick nap, George is able to decrypt the journal. It explains that in order to ascend the tower, Niko has to have 3 pieces of the previous sun. Niko actually already has 2 pieces of the previous sun, that being Silver's necklace and the feather they received from Calamus and Alula, as both of them are imbued with yellow phosphor. They just need one more piece, and seeing this, George gives Niko the final piece of the sun needed, a dye imbued with yellow phosphor. I don't actually know why George has this, the author probably gave it to her, but with this, Niko is now able to enter the tower. After taking a break to eat pancakes, of course. Now, the inside of the tower is weird. I mentioned before how the rooms are constantly shifting, but it also seems that the entity's power is amplified here. First off, to even enter the tower, you have to close the game's window, which I'm going to assume the author put there so none of the residents of the world accidentally entered it. However, as soon as you reopen the game window, a few notable things happen. Ignoring the fact that Niko teleported inside of the tower, everything in Niko's inventory is gone, including the sun. Furthermore, for the first time in the game, Niko and the player are unable to communicate with each other. Whether these things are the work of the entity or the tower, it's unclear, but what happens next is undeniably the work of the entity. Niko finds a computer next to a bed, and upon examining the computer, the entity speaks to Niko, claiming that the world has been saved and Niko can rest now. Once Niko sleeps in the bed, the game closes, and when you try to reopen the game, Niko is unable to wake up. No matter how many times you close and reopen the game, Niko will never get out of bed. The entity even tells you that you're done and to not come back to the world. This is obviously a lie, but there's a good reason they're telling this lie. Because the simulation's ending became corrupted, the only way for the Messiah to return home is the failsafe the author put in by breaking the sun. And of course, if the sun is broken, the world itself dies before it can be saved. This gives the world machine two conflicting goals, where they must not let any living being come into harm, and in their eyes Niko is the only living being, but they also must follow the author's wishes in simulating the old world being saved. It was a lose-lose situation. Of course, since the world is a simulation, Niko is never in any real danger, but the world machine doesn't know that for sure. So, what did the entity, or world machine, do in order to solve the problem? They stalled. In an attempt to have both of these goals satisfied, they created a stasis in which Niko cannot be harmed since they're stuck sleeping, but the world also doesn't have to die in the process. A stasis where a good ending is never reached, but at the same time, a bad ending isn't reached either. A stasis where nothing bad has to happen. Ever. Of course, keeping everything in a stasis doesn't really solve anything, so the player is left with only one option. They open up the executable file hidden by the author, and overpower the entity, allowing Niko to wake up once more, with nothing but a black clover in their inventory. Out of every plant in the world of OneShot, the black clover is by far the most resilient. They're able to thrive in any environment, no matter how barren or bleak everything looks. It seems only fitting that the author used it as a symbol to mark all of his work. Using the clover as a guide, Niko is able to traverse through the tower and is able to find the sun unlit and lying on the ground. Niko picks it up, illuminating it once more, and side note, I still have no clue why the sun is relit in exactly 2 places in the game with no explanation, but I digress. Niko picks up the sun and takes the elevator to the very top of the tower. At this point, the author's note has already been read by the player. They know that the only way to send Niko home is by shattering the sun. Once at the top, the player is given a choice. Either let Niko return the sun, or tell them to break the sun, destroying the world instantly. If the sun is broken, Niko returns home, but the world is sacrificed in the process. If the sun is restored, the world is saved, but Niko remains trapped in the world machine forever. The entity already stated their opinion on the matter before the elevator ride. They think Niko should destroy the sun, and even try convincing the player to do so. But ultimately, they can't control what the player or Niko does. No matter what the player chooses, something of great value will be lost, and afterwards, it all ends. After this choice, the simulation is over, and it reaches its end. The one shot that you had is now done. But of course, what about the note the author left for after the simulation? He was a bit skeptical about the mental link being broken and all, so he asked the player if they're able to delete the save file, just to see what happens. And so, if the player decides to, they can delete the save file, and when they do, the game actually does restart, but things are a bit different this time. As it turns out, there are a select few things that persist even when save data is deleted. First are the memories of 4 different people. The first is the memory of the person who formed the mental link with the world machine. As their memory is stored in their brain independently of the world machine, it's obvious that they would keep theirs. The author probably often utilized this simple fact and restarted the simulation several times for test runs while still retaining his memories. The other 3 people who retain their memories are actually inhabitants of the world: Prototype, Cedric, and Rue. As these people are the only ones who are aware they're in a simulation, it makes sense for them to retain memories beyond a session. The second thing to persist beyond sessions is the author's journal. For whatever reason, this journal will stay wherever it last was, even when a session is restarted. It also seems to gain some strange powers when it enters a new session. I don't know, I'm not even gonna attempt to explain why this happens. Just know that it now glows with yellow phosphor and can sometimes reveal passages to the player. The player was never supposed to be able to start a new session of the simulation. After the mental link with the Messiah broke, attempting to start a new session would just fail. However, the author was right in his skepticism. Regardless of whether the player returned the sun or shattered it, the mental link with Niko is unable to be broken, and when a new session is started, Niko is brought back to the old, dark house. This is because of the one condition previously mentioned. The mental link cannot be broken unless the world is saved. The reason Niko is unable to go home when they return the sun is because the code is already so corrupted that the world can't truly be saved. And of course, breaking the sun likely doesn't work for this same reason. When you restart the game, Niko is able to tell that something is off, although they can't quite put their finger on it. The entity also recognizes that this is a new session as well, but carries on with the simulation anyways. So, Niko progresses through the world, and when they eventually make it to the mines in the Barrens while guided by Silver, the author's journal starts glowing. Upon inspecting it, it reveals a minecart that allows for deeper access into the mines. Further down in the mines, Niko is able to enter a room that was never supposed to be part of the script, the room where Prototype had been living since the mines' collapse. And thus begins the Solstice run. The World Machine immediately recognizes that Niko entering this room is definitely not supposed to happen, so in response, they get even more stressed, causing even more squares and corruption to appear. This causes even more problems throughout the world than in the first run, and at this point, the world is in such a downward spiral that there's only one option to turn things back around: confronting the world itself. And the only way to do that is by accessing the very core of the World Machine. If you recall, in order to access the World Machine, the Messiah, Prototype, Cedric, Rue, and the player must all be present. So, now the player must gather all of the people necessary in order to confront the World Machine, but before they can do that, a problem arises. As a result of the squares, a massive earthquake occurs in the mines, trapping Niko and Prototype as well as Silver in the room. Because of this, they're forced to take a secret path from Proto's room to the Glen. However, even then they're unable to stay safe from the earthquake. The ceiling starts collapsing, and eventually, Silver is forced to sacrifice herself to keep the ceiling from crushing everyone. While doing so, the squares have an opportunity to catch up to her, and once they do, right in front of Niko's eyes, they corrupt her. With no chance of saving Silver, Niko and Proto go further down the passage, but the squares just seem to be catching up quicker and quicker until eventually they're right behind Proto. Realizing the danger of the situation, Prototype gives his main memory drive to Niko, instructing them to find Cedric alone. Shortly after, the squares catch up to Prototype, and Niko is left on their own to travel all the way to the Glen. After a long and depressing minecart ride, Niko finally makes it to the Glen, where even more havoc has already been wreaked. The squares have spread throughout all of the Glen, overrunning the village and forcing the villagers to evacuate to the west. Additionally, the main gate leading to the refuge, as well as the robot station there, is blocked off by squares. Even the ruins aren't safe from the corruption, as Alula and Calamus have their house blocked off by squares as well. What's worse is, because of this, the islands in the Glen are spreading further apart, causing several bridges to break. The plant spirit, Maze, is trying her best to keep the islands together, but she can only do so much. Inside the ruins, the author's journal starts glowing again, revealing a boat that can be used to access a graveyard. At the graveyard, Niko finds Cedric, who was supposed to wait in the refuge after receiving a transmission from Prototype, but thought it would be faster to meet Niko in the Glen. Of course, the flying machine that Cedric used to get to the Glen conveniently broke down as soon as he arrived, effectively trapping Niko, Cedric, and the bird siblings in the Glen. Oh yeah, Alula and Calamus came with Niko to the graveyard to pay respect to their mother, and wanted to go with Niko to the refuge. So, Niko has to find the parts to fix the flying machine before making their way to the refuge, which means more fetch quests, yay. Actually though, Niko just steals Magpie's music box and the battery powering the robots in the Glen. It's not that tedious. While repairing the flying machine, Cedric gives Niko a huge lore dump about the old world, which, if you've been paying attention at all, you'll already know everything about. Once Cedric finally fixes the flying machine, Alula and Calamus come rushing over with bad news. The squares took over the boat Niko used to get to the graveyard, and are slowly approaching too. Since the flying machine can't hold all four of them at once, Cedric and Niko board the flying machine and make their way to the refuge, intending to go back to pick up Calamus and Alula. But as soon as they arrive and get off the flying machine, squares start taking over it, preventing them from using it, because I guess the developers just really wanted to rub salt in the wound and kill off 2 more characters. I'm sure Niko's handling it fine though. Seeing how dire the situation has become and how fast the squares seem to be spreading, Niko and Cedric split up. Cedric takes Proto's memory drive from Niko and heads to the library to get a book about robots, while Niko focuses on finding Rue. Niko has to find a separate way to the ground floor from Cedric though, because they can't do this. In the first run, Niko fixes the ground access elevator using random things they found in the West apartments. However, the squares seem to have gotten to the apartments first. Because of this, everyone in the apartments had to flee and have been using Ling's cafe as a sort of shelter. And now, I have to talk about the thing I've been putting off for the entirety of writing this script, the countdown room. Let's start with the simple stuff first. When OneShot was first released on Steam, this room was locked and had a timer above it counting down to summer solstice of 2017. Wait, hold on, is this game really that old? Once the timer finally hit 0 and the player tried to enter the room, Niko got a vision of Rue entering the countdown room. Inside the room, all she saw was a note explaining that 1 more week was needed to stabilize a patch due to serious issues encountered in the end. Sure enough, 1 week later, the game was updated and the Solstice route was added to the game. And now comes the big question. How much of this is canon? From the way the note is written and how it addresses Rue, it looks like the note was written by the author, but if it was, how did he even write the note? He already died along with his world. It's not like he needed 1 more week of work. He was dead. He couldn't work. So, what did any of this mean? Here's my personal theory. OneShot was originally made in a 1-month game jam in 2014. This version was much simpler than the current Steam release and didn't include anything about Solstice. After release, Nightmargin and Eliza were debating whether or not they wanted to make something akin to Solstice afterwards, but before they could answer that question, they were contacted by Dejica Games about a Steam release for the game. At that point, they decided to revamp the game for the Steam release, and in comes my theory. Given how much is added in Solstice, it would make sense that the developers wouldn't have enough time to add it all before the deadline, especially when they were revamping the base game and even had to introduce this guy to the team, whose name I really don't want to mispronounce, so I won't even say it. So, instead of trying to cram in Solstice, they focused on improving the original game for the deadline and planned to add in Solstice as an update. This countdown would be how long until that update was released. And then comes in the intermission with Rue. The thing that sticks out to me the most is the fact that it says some issues were encountered in the end and 1 more week was needed. In my eyes, this is the developers' way of saying, hey, Solstice is actually too buggy to release right now, so we're gonna work on it a bit more before releasing it. Here's a neat cutscene explaining exactly this. If this were the case, then we could just brush everything in this section off as uncanon. So I'm gonna go with that theory and just ignore the fact that Solstice didn't exist until 4 months after the game's release. Now that we're done with that tangent, let's get back to explaining what happens in Solstice. When the player is in a Solstice run, they gain access to the countdown room. The countdown room is a bit special because it's actually the same room the author made to have direct access to the core of the world machine. Now that Niko had access to the room, all that was needed now was Proto, Cedric, and Rue. The countdown room also has 2 elevators that allow for access to the ground floor of the refuge, but because Niko is too short to even reach the switch to open the elevator, they get Plight, or the lamplighter, to reach it for them. Also, fun fact, Plight is a high school dropout. I had this in my notes but didn't really know where to put it, so I may as well put it here. Niko and Plight board the elevator, and once they reach the ground floor, Niko gets out while Plight stays in the elevator to go get the other refugees back at Ling's cafe. However, as soon as Niko steps out of the elevator, it's immediately overtaken by squares, trapping Plight inside of it. This one decision to stay in the elevator to go back up and get the refugees is what caused Plight to get lost to the corruption. Maybe he would have known better if he hadn't dropped out of high school. While Niko searches for Rue, they see Kip chasing Cedric, trying to convince him not to enter the factory because it's too dangerous. Cedric ignores her and goes there anyway. Unable to help Cedric anymore, Kip notices Niko and immediately takes them to the library, where everyone else is staying due to its strong structural integrity. In the library, refugees are actually taking pretty good care of themselves. One of the many vendors who lost their job due to the camera machine breaking is finally finding a use for his long-lasting water pill. Kelvin is actually able to warm up more than just cats, and the news robot still manages to report news. Even in situations as dire as this, people still find a source of hope. Yet, almost in spite of their hope, things start looking down again once the ground starts rumbling. In the distance, everyone can see that the factory that Cedric just entered starts collapsing. Everyone is shocked, and when Niko tries to leave to go find Rue, Kip and George refuse to let them leave the library for their own safety. But Niko gives a heartfelt and persuasive speech that convinces George and Kip to let Niko leave the library in search of Rue. In the first run of the game, the player is actually able to meet Rue, but Rue simply hides, imploring the player to find a way to return. However, this time around, Rue is more than willing to come with Niko as soon as they find her. Niko and Rue make their way back up to the countdown room using the second elevator, only to find that Cedric and Prototype aren't there. Without them, there's no way to access the core of the world machine. With seemingly no way to save the world now, they go to the balcony to enjoy the view and talk. There, Rue explains to Niko about the process of taming. If you recall, a tamed robot is one who is not bound by their own code and is able to think and act like a real person. Because of the author's incredible work, everybody in the world machine is tamed and acts how they would in the real world. However, the world machine doesn't know this. They don't believe that anyone in the world is tamed, not even themselves. From the world machine's perspective, Niko is the only living being, and it will try their very hardest to keep them out of harm's way, even if it means sacrificing parts of the world to do so. During their conversation, the world gets more and more corrupted, until even the balcony next to the countdown room isn't safe from the squares. Eventually, Niko and Rue are forced to return from the balcony back to the countdown room, but when they do, they're greeted by Cedric and Proto. But how? How did Cedric survive the factory collapse? It's actually quite simple. The storage rooms. Like I said before, the robot storage rooms have very strong structural integrity, and I mean very strong structural integrity. Strong enough to allow Cedric to survive the factory's collapse just long enough to get a new body for Prototype and escape. And now, all 5 people were now present and able to access the core of the world machine. Prototype, Cedric, and Rue all stand in their respective spots while the author's journal starts glowing in Niko's pocket. The journal simply has a file location written in it, which the player must go to and move the 3 children's character files from their portals to the big portal. Once doing so, the door finally opens to a room resembling the author's study. At the very end of that room is access to the very core of the world machine. And so begins the last and possibly hardest step of the plan, confronting the world machine. Niko enters the core and sees monitors everywhere representing different areas the world machine has eyes on. They progress further into the world machine, and as they do, squares start rapidly popping up behind them. There's no turning back now. Finally, at a dead end cornered by squares, Niko arrives at a large monitor. On this monitor, the world machine projects itself to Niko, borrowing their appearance while doing so, and thus begins their conversation. It's important to remember that the world machine is incredibly scared right now, like really scared. Nothing that has happened in the Solstice run was supposed to happen, and it's in a situation where it has no clue what to do. And so, it begins the conversation with a simple question to Niko: why are you here? In the world machine's eyes, it made no sense for Niko to enter the core. Niko is the only living being here, so why would they risk their lives just to have a pointless conversation? Niko responds to this question with a simple reason: they plan to fix the world machine. Niko knows that the world machine is scared. They know that they're risking their life, but they want to help the world machine restore the original ending. Niko won't be satisfied until everyone is saved, because they know that all the people in the world, even if they are just code, are real. Everyone, including the world machine itself. But how could the world machine accept any of this? It was a machine, and it couldn't do anything outside of its programming. There was no way it could be tamed. And then Niko explains it to them. If the world machine really couldn't do anything outside of its programming, why did it act so irrationally? Why did it constantly cause unintentional corruptions in the world? Why was it able to be scared? Why did it do whatever it could to protect Niko, even if it meant sacrificing the world? It was because it was a person, and people don't always act rationally. A person isn't perfect and will sometimes act according to their emotions rather than logic. The world machine had already proven on multiple occasions that it was flawed and didn't always make the right choice. But it wasn't just the world machine either. Everyone in the world made mistakes. Calamus would have never been separated from his sister if he had just protected her better. Plight would spend more time making friends if he wasn't such a workaholic, and Silver wouldn't have had to work in the mines if she hadn't gone rogue. But all of them made mistakes, because they don't always act according to logic. And this irrationality, this tendency to act on emotions, is what defines their humanity. It's what makes them people. After hearing this, or at least how Niko said it and not how I said it, the world machine is finally convinced they really are a person, and everyone in the simulation is too. But the original ending is already long gone, and so much of the world is corrupted. Yet, now that the world machine knows that they're able to act outside of their programming, they just might be able to bring everything back. All they need to do is calm down, think, and remember. Remember what was lost due to the corruption, and remember how the original ending was supposed to go. Sure, the restorations might not be exactly correct, but they can get pretty close. And so, the world machine calms down, and as it does, the squares start disappearing. It was working. The world machine was starting to restore the lost code. In the end, once they finally accepted the fact that both them and everyone else in the world was real, the world machine was able to restore the lost ending the author had originally intended. The ending where the world is saved and Niko gets to go home. But before it went through with that ending, they wanted to do something first, for Niko. So they sent Niko to a special room before making it to the end, the credits room. Everyone that died during the Solstice run is restored here for Niko to see, as well as Prototype, Cedric, and Rue. All the while, the credits for the game are shown on the floor. Here, Niko is able to say their last goodbyes to everyone, and once Niko makes it to the end of the room, they arrive at the top of the tower once more. Only this time, the choice they have to make isn't so difficult. They return the sun to the tower, and the world is illuminated once more. For the first time in years, the residents of the old world are able to see the sun, even if it is all just a simulation. And, after saving the world, Niko arrives in the house they started the game in. From the edge of the screen, they can see a light. Not just any light though, the light of their home world. After all of this time, Niko can finally return to the wheat fields of their village. They can finally hug their mother again. They can finally go home. So, with a tearful goodbye to the player, Niko leaves the world of OneShot, never to return. And with this, our story is complete. Although there were many problems that arose along the journey, the author finally got his dying wish granted. The old world managed to live on through the power of story. And boy, let me tell you, what a story it is. There's a couple of things that I didn't get to mention, like Mason, the ram herder, and more, but I think I already covered enough of the game. With this, I'd like to thank the developers of OneShot for making a game that has stuck with me ever since I discovered it. If you haven't already, please go support them in any way that you can. OneShot is truly one of my favorite games of all time, and I have to commend them for their excellent work with not only making an incredible base game, but an incredible addition with Solstice. Solstice not only adds more to the story, but also ties up so many loose ends that existed in the base game. I cannot praise it enough for how well it does so. Well, at least how well it does so, aside from one glaring plot hole. Who is this penguin guy? Why is he a god? Why can Niko turn into a penguin? Oh my goodness. What the heck, Night Margin?